Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear, and I'm going to quickly do a video for you on how to simply tune the Brian Brown Knives Yeager-M. This is from the most recent batch of the Yeager-M production run. These are Reat built knives, and this knife is, in my opinion, really easy to tune from the outside. So this is not going to be a full disassembly. I'll show that in a different video, but here you'll be able to see if you just notice that your knife begins to come off center, which this one is not, so we'll have to make it uncentered to show you what that looks like in a moment. But if your blade comes off center, it starts to walk to either side of the handle rather than staying lined up in the middle, then you'll want to adjust your pivot, as I'll show you. Or if you just notice that the action starts to get a little bit grittier than you prefer, it should be on ceramic bearings a very smooth action, so sometimes that just requires a little bit of lubricant. I'll show you how and where to add that from the outside of the knife without taking it apart, and then also just making sure that we keep the ceramic detent lubricated as well. So I'll show you how to do all those things real quick, and that way you can be on your way with your Yeager, keeping it nice and in line and smooth. So all of the hardware on this knife is Torx T8, so you're going to need a T8 bit driver. This is actually a Brian Brown driver, so that's fitting for this video, but this is just a fancy titanium bearing driven driver. You don't have to use one this fancy. If you don't have Torx drivers, I recommend ordering a set of Weehaws or something like that. I use these all the time. Just make sure you have a good crisp bit in your driver, and that it's not stripped or like wearing down, because a good sharp driver makes good precise adjustments. So we only have one tooled side of the pivot here, which means we're going to use that spot to adjust the pivot. I'm going to loosen this enough to show you what the knife may look like if it comes off center. And this knife is so precise that it's still pretty on center. You can see I'm walking this pivot screw all the way to where it's totally loose. The collar is free floating now, and I'm still centered just on how the pivot is tuned, because the pivot barrel is tight within the blade, and then the way these body screws hold everything together. But imagine yours comes a little bit off center just because this is loose. Maybe if I work the action, yeah, there we go. So having worked the action, we're now way off center, okay? Because my pivot is loose, the blade has the ability to walk now, and we don't want that. We want it to stay right and centered 50-50 between each side of those scales. So if this happens to you, most of the time, a simple tuning of the pivot by turning to where we are nice and tight, and then I like to back off just the smallest hair from fully tight. That's where I generally like my action on a frame lock like this. Bada bing, bada boom. We're feeling good, and we're centered again. So if you have a good Torx driver, you can usually recenter your knife pretty easily without disassembling it. So good thing to know there. The other thing you're going to want to do, I'll actually re-loosen the pivot a hair for this, because I like to do this with the pivot a little loose. For some reason I find that works better for me. So the other thing you're going to want is a good knife lubricant. It doesn't have to be KPL, it's just what I have on the table. I own several different knife lubricants, like Gunny Glide as well. I use a few different things, they all work fine for me. There's nano oil, there's all kinds of stuff. KPL is super simple and works for me, so I like to use this in the bearings. This is regular KPL. I also have KPL Heavy. Do you need to have both of these? No. For a long time, I even used like, if you're a firearms person, you might have like some Hoppy's gun lubricant. Most lubricants can get the job done. These are just specific to knives, and so they generally, in my experience, last pretty well and just feel a little bit more dialed in for what we're trying to do here. But any lubricant is generally good for bearings. I shouldn't say any. Many lubricants will work. So I'm using KPL here. All I'm going to try to do is from the top of the knife, I'm going to get a little bit of lubricant in between the scale and the blade so that it can get into the bearings. So I really only want to get 1 or 2 drops in per side, just enough that it can dribble down there, start working itself into the bearings. Putting too much lubricant can sometimes gum up your action rather than helping it. So I don't want to go too overboard, I just want to put enough. So I've got that in there with the pivot still a little loose. I'm not rubbing or anything like that. I'm going to go ahead and just let that work itself into the bearings a little bit because my pivot's loose, I'm just feeling a little more grittiness than I would otherwise. I'm making sure I kind of like spread that lube out. Now I'm gonna go ahead and retighten my pivot down, get to where I'm centered. Again, I'm gonna back off just a hair from fully tight, and I'm centered. I've lubricated my bearings, and now this knife is even smoother than it was before I started. So there you have that. The only other step that I recommend doing is, because we have a ceramic detent ball here, the way that that detent ball works, if you can make it out in there, there's just a little ceramic ball. That is what is holding the blade closed in the closed position and allowing it to have some pop so that it opens correctly. That runs against the steel of the blade and creates a little bit of a track for itself over time. It also sits in a pocket when the blade is closed. So by lubricating that, it'll allow it to run smoother through the track that it's created, and we'll just make sure that everything is nice and slick where I want it to be nice and slick. So I'm gonna put just a drop of KPL heavy. I'm gonna really squeeze this bottle. There we go. Drop of KPL heavy on that ceramic detent. And now I'm gonna run that through the track a little bit. Can feel a little bit more smoothness there than I did before. Make sure it gets all the way down into the hole. And bada bing, bada boom. This knife is tuned up and centered and ready to go in pocket and keep on working for you. So if you need to tune your knife, that's kind of the gist of it on the Brian Brown Knives Yeager-M. And that's the way that I recommend dealing with centering issues, or if your action becomes a little gritty. Oftentimes people will think they need to take the knife all the way apart to deal with things like that. And more often than not, I found that it's the case that by some simple tuning of the pivot and some simple application of a little bit of lubricant, your knife will be back in fighting shape really easily, and it's much less of a process than fully disassembling. But there will be a subsequent video showing the disassembly and reassembly of this knife if that's something you need to do as well. So thanks for taking a look. We'll see you on the next one.